And to get us started, while people are thinking of their questions, if you could just maybe give us a quick intro. And folks have already kind of read a little bit about your project that you did here with the CLAS scholars. But if you wanted to maybe give a quick update on what you've done since finishing the program, maybe we can start with that.
Sure. So, yeah, hi guys. My name is Dominic Mayo. I graduated this past spring from the University of Florida. I had a BS in wildlife ecology and conservation and a BA in anthropology. I did my project for CLAS scholars on the feeding ecology of feral dogs or free roaming dogs in Madagascar. And now I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Michigan. I'm studying anthropology there. Specifically, my focus is on biological anthropology. So the ecology and evolution of primates. That's my passion. Since completing my CLAS scholar stuff and all my undergrad thesis and all that stuff, I had an internship with the Smithsonian. I was a One Health intern at their Rock Creek Institute. It was online because of the pandemic, but it was a One Health Center internship, which basically takes into account the health of the environment, the wildlife, and humans within a shared system. So that was a pretty cool experience. Aside from that, now at the University of Michigan, I'm a part of a mentoring program where I help undergrads find research opportunities and just hoping to get more involved in campus at this point. I've been in Michigan now, I guess, what day is it? About 3 weeks. So it's a lot different from Gainesville, Florida, but it's been pretty awesome.
Awesome. It's a lot of cool stuff. Oh, I thought that might be our second guest joining us, but it's actually Tushar. Who wants to get us started with a question for Dominic? And to be totally honest, I have not, in the little time we've seen each other, put names to faces yet. So when you ask your question, say your name, both so Dominic will know and so I can watch the video later and be sure you get credit. Yeah, you want to start us?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Rhiannon, and my question is about the CLAS Scholars Program just in general, like what exactly it's like about and your personal experience, like getting involved with that.
Well, from my personal experience as CLAS scholars, it was a program that was put in place to kind of uplift undergrad researchers and kind of give them that opportunity to engage in research and research projects at UF, at our institution. For me, I found CLAS scholars through the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I just joined the anthropology program, and I had an idea for a project studying lemurs in Madagascar. I had come up with it with my advisor, and it was just a Google search that I ended up finding university scholars and CLAS scholars. And I decided to apply for both, and I was accepted to CLAS scholars. And with the pandemic, obviously the research project changed and there was some remote parts to it. But overall, it was just, it just felt like the right program for me, especially because it was giving me a chance to do research, do my own project, which in the past I had been a part of three other projects across the university as a research assistant, as a volunteer research assistant. But this was my first time to actually be, the head researcher on the job.
Awesome. In the back corner.
And my name is Florencia, and I wanted to ask you if you could please go a little bit further or explain a little bit more about how you can help students to get to the research and find what we're looking for.
Were you able to hear that okay?
No, I wasn't, sorry.
Can you please explain a little bit more about how you get students to get the research thing going? Are there some steps or do you have any advices for us?
Basically, advice about getting started in research, is that the question? Yeah, so advice about how to get started as a student in research.
That's a great question. For me, it happened, it was kind of serendipitous. I was in the colloquium class for my wildlife ecology major, and a grad student had come in and he was talking about his research project, and he was asking for volunteers if they were interested in learning more about the project. And what that was studying was actually insects and their movement throughout a fragmented landscape, which wasn't really anything I was particularly interested in, but I wanted to get my foot in the door when it comes to research. So I reached out to this grad student. I ended up working on his project for, gosh, I guess it was technically 3 years, both in the field and just in his lab. So getting started in research really just involves you reaching out to someone in any capacity, whether it be in class and like he gave the presentation, or for me, I also met someone who helped with my research just by going to a club meeting where they were presenting their research and I got to talk to them about it. It's really just approaching people and asking them if there's an opportunity to get involved, because the worst they can say is no, and the best they can say is yes, and then you get that chance.
Awesome. Yeah, let's in the front. Yeah,
Okay, Olivia.
Olivia.
So you went to Madagascar for your research. So how does that like logistically work with like terms and like school itself on top of going abroad for research?
So that's a great question. So I actually didn't have to go abroad for my specific project. Although I was studying free roaming dogs in Madagascar, that data had been collected a summer prior by another undergraduate who worked with my professor, but they weren't as interested in the project and they had already moved on to another institution. So at that point, I was able to take over. My original project idea was to go to Madagascar and work with lemurs, but because of the pandemic, everything, was kind of put on hold. In that sense, when I was planning the logistics of that actually involved a lot of logistics with the university and Madagascar's government, because to do research abroad, you have, especially in Madagascar, where you're working in a national park, you have to get a lot of different forms signed. Obviously, you have to get approval from the university, from their, and then since I was working with animals, also there's a whole other institution that you have to go through to get, your form signed to make sure everything you're doing is a-okay. So in that sense, there was a lot of paperwork involved, and it was a lot of communicating with the administrators in my department and within UF. But because all that was put on hold because of the pandemic, and I was able to join this project on free roaming dogs, all the data was already, all the samples, were already at the University of Florida. And so it just required me to get clearance early on during the pandemic to come back to campus and do that work in lab.
Okay, yeah, let's go with you next.
My name is Kirthana, and I was just wondering, like, the time frame that it took for you to like start your research and kind of conclude or like get results from it.
You
Dr.
able to hear that?
No, I wasn't again. Sorry, that it must either it's my audio or it's just the mic there. But can you repeat it, Dr. Watson, for her?
So her name's Kirthana, and her question is the time frame for your CLAS Scholars project. How long did it take from starting until getting results or getting the final deliverables that you were able to produce?
That is a great question. So, for my CLAS Scholars project that I completed, it started in August, going into the lab, so August of 2020, and actually organizing the samples and then extracting the DNA and then sending that off to another lab I was collaborating with at the university. That took until, I think, about 2 months. At the end of September, I think, was when we finally finished extracting the DNA. We then actually went to the University of Florida's veterinary hospital and did some x-rays on our samples of dog feces to kind of see if we could find any bones or fragments in them that we could also identify using morphological characteristics, which we were able to do. So that went into September, October-ish. And then actually analyzing the DNA had gone on until around March. We were still analyzing the DNA and sequencing it in the lab. And by that point, I had already started working more on the bone fragments we had found and kind of writing about that and what that could imply about dogs' ecology. So I finished my project in I guess you could say around March and April, but there's still parts of that project related to DNA sequencing that we're actually still working on now, and is actually going to be in a published paper in the upcoming year. So, although I finished my CLAS Scholars project, it actually opened doors to more projects that I'm continuing to work on after I left UF.
Exciting. Let's see. Let's go with you next.
So in regards to the CLAS Scholars Program, my name is Amelia. What do you think is the best way to distinguish yourself on the application?
Wait, I did not catch the whole question again, and I'm really sorry. I really think it's my laptop because y'all have probably the mic in the room is probably like really fancy, but yeah, Dr. Watson, do you mind repeating it for me again?
It's all good. You know what? I'll just repeat them all, and you won't have to strain. So her question was about applying to CLAS Scholars. How do you feel like you can distinguish yourself on that application, or do a good job, stand out, that sort of thing, on the CLAS Scholars application?
That's a great question. For me, I think what helped make me stand out is that I had a clear idea of what I wanted to work on when I submitted the project, and I had a good idea of the background information needed to perform the project. So when I first applied to CLAS Scholars, like I said, my project had to do with lemurs and lemur ecology in Madagascar. And so I had actually applied for another grant at the time just for a similar project with my professor, kind of like to help write it. And I had a good idea of the background information I needed. So when I was writing my CLAS Scholars application, I had the knowledge I needed to convey the ideas in a way that was easy for other people to understand and really encapsulate what the project was about. And so having a good grasp of like the background of what you want to work on is really beneficial, because if you can understand it, then you can convey that to someone else in a way that makes them understand it, even if they're not, experts in that specific topic.
Excellent. Yeah.
My name's Mia, and how did you know which topic that you wanted to research, or like how did you choose a topic?
So the question from Mia is topic selection for research. How does one choose a topic to work on?
That's a great question too. I found my topics of research from meeting with my professor. I actually first met with her in office hours. I was in her discussion class, and office hours wasn't required, but I thought it was a good idea because I was interested in her research and I wanted to learn more about it. And so I made an appointment and I met with her, and it literally was the first appointment that I met with her. I said, I kind of am interested in the research you do with lemur ecology, and I think it would be interesting to work on a project. And she said, yeah, I think you'd be a great candidate for that sort of thing. Let's discuss ideas. And we kind of just discussed our mutual interests and where they overlapped. And once that happened, we came up with an idea for the project.
Awesome. Yeah, in the middle there.
My name's Hannah. Is there anything in the whole process that you wish you had done differently when conducting your research?
Anna's asking if there's anything in the process that, looking back, you wish you had done it differently.
Differently. That's a good question. I think something that I would have done differently, and yeah, I think something I would have done differently is that when we did the DNA sequencing of from our samples, I wasn't always like, so I did the extractions for the DNA, and I was also there for the X-raying of the samples, and I did all the analysis of the X-ray stuff afterwards. But I wasn't there for part of the molecular process, which was basically where they sequence the DNA and kind of match it up to known genera and different organisms, so we can kind of see like what these dogs are eating. And so I wish I was there for that part of the molecular process, because since I'm an undergrad, it takes a lot of experience and technique to accomplish that. So I couldn't necessarily do that on my own. But because of the pandemic, I was kind of restricted on when I could go into their lab and see them do the process of that. So as if I could go back, I would like to see that, because in my work now as a PhD student, I am interested in molecular ecology and looking at the genetics of primates. So I think it would have been cool to see that and be a part of that experience, especially because I was working with another collaborator in another department. So it would have been a really great chance to also get some interdisciplinary experience.
Yeah, over there.
Hi, my name is Maria Jose, and I was wondering if, oftentimes we start with one research question, and then as we go about the process, like we find that we're actually asking a different question. Did you ever find yourself in that situation?
So Maria Jose is asking about research questions. It's actually a topic that we've done some reading about in this class, and one of the readings talks about starting with a question. It's not necessarily the question you're going to end up with. So having the research question that you're pursuing evolve and change along the way. Oh, Jeff is here. I'll let you answer that question, but let me just say, hi, Jeff, can you hear us?
Hey y'all, sorry I'm late. I had some tech issues, so I had to come to campus to fix them.
It happens. Let me get you up here where people can see you better. So Dominic was just about to answer a question about research questions, but after that, we'll see if we can direct some questions towards you. And actually, after Dominic finishes, I'm going to have you do a little quick introduction, if you don't mind.
All right, no problem.
Thanks. I'm glad you could join us.
All right, so what was the question, Dr. Watson?
I think was I on the right track? You were asking about research questions. If your research question ever shifted through the process.
Well, yes and no. So it shifted in the sense that, my original project had to be put on hold because of the pandemic, and then I picked up. So I went from studying, the feeding ecology of lemurs, the feeding ecology of the free roaming dogs that shared the habitat with the lemurs. So in that sense, it did change, and it was a result of the pandemic. But when it came to the foundation of the questions, which were, what are these animals eating, and what does that have to do with their ecology and their niche or their role in the ecosystem, or the implications that their feeding might have on the conservation of other animals in that habitat, that kind of stayed the same throughout. But you make a good point, I think, at least if I believe I heard it right. Research questions that you start off with can change through time. And I've seen it in the lab I'm in now, and the labs I've worked with, that, you start off with this one question, but as you start gathering more information, the research question can change, and that's totally fine. That's just a part of the process.
Awesome. Well, let's take a quick short pause from the questions now, since we have a second guest joining us. And Jeff, if you don't mind, the students have looked at your University Scholars Project a little bit. They're a little bit familiar with the topic you were working on with that. But if you wouldn't mind, just give a quick intro to yourself, and maybe you could talk about what you've been doing since completing the University Scholars Program. Kind of give us an update to start with.
Yeah, sure. So my name's JT. It says Jeff, but that's just my government name. I majored in history and international studies with a minor in Arabic at UF. You see my USP project. Now I'm a grad student at the University of Texas, Austin, where I do in a master's program for Middle Eastern Studies. Beyond that, I'm a teaching assistant now. I'm in a couple of organizations from my time at UF that I've carried over to UT. And yeah, I was also Beyond 120, so that's part of why I am speaking to y'all now. So it's nice to, I guess, see y'all, and nice to present.
Awesome, thanks. Apologize for calling you Jeff. That was your email signature, but JT, that's cool. Those are happen to be my initials as well. So neat. So folks, now if you want to ask a question to either JT or Dominic, or if you have a question for both speakers, just let us know when you're asking your question who it's directed to. Yeah.
So, hi Dominic, I'm Ryan. You mentioned that some of your research led to other research opportunities. What are some of those other research opportunities that it led to?
Okay, so and there's a little bit of an audio problem in the room, so I'll just be repeating the question. So Brian asked, what opportunities your doing your research project with CLAS or University Scholars led to that you feel like were direct or indirect outcomes of having done that? He said it's a question for Dominic, but after Dominic, if JT, if you have thoughts on that as well, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, so my project studying, like I said, it was feeding ecology of free roaming dogs. That was looking at, it had implications on the ecosystem health in Madagascar. And so that kind of led me to having discussions with my professor about, just in general, Madagascar's ecology. And then she ended up connecting me with a friend of hers who does work in Madagascar studying similar concepts with lemurs and their interactions with people and ecotourism, which then, with one thing led to another, helped me land that internship with the Smithsonian. So in that sense, it wasn't another research project, but it was a professional development opportunity and a really cool remote internship with a really diverse group of people. On top of that, the research project I had, obviously, the CLAS Scholars project I did led to my undergrad thesis. And then I also am working on a paper with my professor using another facet of that research currently. And with that, yeah, so my CLAS Scholars project led to a few different things. And now, obviously, I'm in grad school, so I'm kind of shifting to a new research sort of framework in my lab. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think being a part of the CLAS Scholars project gave me the ability to kind of network and meet different people with similar interests of me. And I was able to share my research with them and kind of find similar interests and make those connections.
Awesome. Yeah, JT, did you have anything to add on that question?
Not really. Dominic put it pretty well. Your research can lead you not only to other places within other questions that you could have within so your research topic or related topics, but it really bolsters sort of like your interest for future stuff. Like, for example, grad school. My research is still a bit of an inspiration to what I might want to do for papers in classes, or perhaps my master's thesis when I get to it. So it's stuff that, and also, as Dominic mentioned, professional opportunities. He has an internship with Smithsonian, or you had one, congrats for that. But it helped me, at least I hope it helped me get into grad school. So, research doesn't, not only is it going to help you, sort of build up into even more sort of questions to ask and things to look into, to study. But it's going to help you, so bolster your resume when you're looking at professional opportunities or other academic opportunities, like say grad school or academic internships, or especially the further on if you do go into grad school and you have to start doing things like grants or research scholarship. So there's a lot of things that build off research, and it's a things to, I guess, keep in mind and look for future opportunities.
Awesome. Okay, in the back there in the blue.
My name's Tamara. I guess to either of you, I was wondering if you had any prior research experience or related experience to research before applying to the CLAS Scholars program, or like just reaching out to professors in general.
Okay, so Kiara is asking about prior research experience before you applied to CLAS Scholars program, or before even you started reaching out to professors. What was your earliest experience? Dominic, you've talked a little bit about this already, but maybe we go into more detail. But let's maybe start with JT this time. It's just a question for both speakers, she said.
So that's a good question. In my experience, I started out with, as a history major, we have a lot of assignments that are built around basically research, a lot of writing. So I guess I would count that as experience. Before I did USP, and before I did my undergrad thesis, I did the two sort of final seminar classes that I had in my majors, a history seminar and international studies seminars, and those were both research-based. The final project was like a 30-page research paper. So those helped me out. They weren't sort of relevant to the topic I had for my thesis, but they were germane to sort of learning how to do research. But even then, research it's not something that is difficult to get into in terms of learning, doing things like looking up sources, or I would say it's easy to get into, but it's got a high skill ceiling, because there's a lot of things like refining your research topic, refining sort of what sources you want to look at, what kind of sources you're geared towards. And a lot of that, a lot of the help you're going to get is from, if you work with a professor in your research who, they've done this for, basically this is their job, is to do research, right? In a lot of cases, So I know in my experience, Dr. Jacobs, who was my advisor, was a great help in terms of, basically guiding me through the research process and how to do things like refine a topic, sort of what to look into when I'm looking through sources. So even if you're entirely new to research, you're going to have a lot of great resources to help you out, whether it be, your advisor, or you can always go to a professor that who is perhaps who teaches something relevant to the topic, and ask them for assistance. So it's daunting, but even with that, even with little experience, you can find a lot of good help to get started.
Awesome. Anything to add to that, Dominic?
Yeah, I think JT did a great job of explaining it. I think the only thing that would be a little different from my own perspective, I guess, was that when it came to finding the research, like I started off, instead of going directly to the professor, I actually went to grad students. So like I said, the first grad student that came in and was asking if people were interested in joining on his project that he was doing, I worked with him. And then I was at a meeting within my club and my major, and I met another grad student who was asking a similar question. And I just reached out to them because, their grad students are, they were, obviously undergrads not too long ago. So they kind of know where you are and kind of how you're feeling as an undergrad trying to get involved in research. And so I found that they were more willing to work with you and kind of take a chance on you, because they could see that you were interested in wanting to maybe follow in a similar route that they did. I mean, I think I didn't actually meet a professor and talk about research with them until maybe a year into actually doing research with the graduate students. And so I kind of built up that rapport with the graduate students, and then the graduate students would obviously talk to the professors about the work I was doing with them, because they do that with their lab meetings, at least in my context. And at that point, when I met them, they already kind of knew who I was. And then when I would talk to them about the research, and then when I would ask, the potential for future research opportunities, it kind of made it easier. And so I definitely think, if I can give a recommendation, is just, if you're maybe a little nervous about going to the office hours, or maybe you don't know the professor too well yet and you don't want to just jump right into it, maybe contact a graduate student who's doing work and maybe see if they're looking for help.
Awesome. Yeah, in the back in the red.
Okay, so question for both. I think Dominic already might have answered this a little bit, but how did you guys find a mentor for your research projects, and how do you recommend reaching out to mentors and getting feedback for your research projects in your respective areas?
Okay, and your name again?
Kevin.
So Kevin is asking, we kind of covered this a little bit, but maybe there's more to be said about ways to find research mentors. And then the second part of the question was about getting feedback from your mentor on your research project. We haven't really gone into that kind of communication with the mentor aspect yet. So it's a question for both. So let's see, who wants to, should we start with JT again and then Dominic?
So that's a really good question, especially the second part. As Dominic mentioned, one way to find a mentor is to go through the grad students almost, especially if you're uneasy about going directly to a professor that you don't know. That way, if they're grad students in sort of the same research area as that professor, you'll sort of have some knowledge going into it, and they will perhaps, through the grad students, get to know who you are. In my experience, I didn't have a lot of options. There aren't many historians who do the Middle East at UF, especially not at the moment. So what I basically did, as soon as I started getting into research, I had started going to office hours for these professors. But that was just in my experience. I would recommend, if you can, go to the faculty page of whatever department you're in or whatever department you want to work in, and go to the faculty pages for professors that might be interesting to work with, and see sort of what kind of research interests they have or what past research they've done. That all of that should be listed on, if not their faculty page, then perhaps their CVs, which should be attached to faculty pages. That way you can start to see sort of what research areas these professors are in who might be relevant to sort of your interests. And then from there, if you can, I would recommend taking classes with those professors. I took 2 classes with Dr. Jacobs before I started working on research with him. And that way the professor they get to know you first as a person, and then they get to know your work, because they're going to be, at least in the humanities, they're going to be seeing the way you write, the sort of way you broach questions in the class and assignments for the class. They'll get to know your work ethic. In terms of getting feedback, in my experience and what I did with my professors, that we set up sort of bi-weekly meetings, then turn into weekly meetings. So every week or every 2 weeks at the start, I would sort of, we'd get together and we'd go, okay, what's the progress for this week on the paper? What's the progress you have so far in terms of getting sources together and, getting into topics? And obviously, once it got towards the end of the sort of cycle, once I started finalizing my thesis, it came down a lot to, okay, how can we make this paragraph better? How can we make this sentence feel stronger towards sort of the argument that you're making? So that was my experience. Some professors may want to do a different way of sort of meeting. Some might be just over email. I did Zoom because that was what was, in the fad at the time. But I would recommend, if your professor is okay with it, to meet, sort of like at least once a week, every 2 weeks. That way you have some time to get work in, to get sort of have some questions for them. And that way you can get feedback from them if you send them any work you have over the week. And they hopefully will get back to you about, how to strengthen this or maybe remove that or the like.
Yeah, I think JT said it perfectly. I mean, he covered basically everything. I would just, I guess, just reiterate some of the things he said that I like super agree with, which is, when it comes, so for me, finding that mentor, when I found my mentor for the CLAS scholars, it was really just like, I think he made a good point. Looking at the faculty pages is a really great way to get to know their research, and then taking the classes with them. For me, I found like taking the class with them and kind of building up that rapport with them in class, and then going to the office hours. I know when I was a freshman and I started at the University of Florida, I never wanted to go to office hours. I didn't see the point. And then I realized very quickly before the end of my freshman year that going to office hours is a great way to get to know the professor. And especially if you want to get involved in their research, it's a really easy way to find a time where they are available and then they're willing to talk to you. And so like for me, I went to the office hours. That's how I met my mentor. And, it was perfect. It was a really great match. When it comes to getting feedback, similar to what JT had said, I think, at least from the mentor that I had, bi-weekly was a pretty good standard. We'd meet every other week and just kind of talk about where the research was going. And I would ask, for me, I think a lot of getting feedback is you being proactive and just asking. I mean, for me, like if I was working on something and let's say we had a meeting the day before and then I was working on it the next day and I was like, oh, I just started this next question, I would just email them. I'd ask, hey, I need feedback on this. Like I just started on it, whatever. So it's a lot of you kind of advocating for yourself with them and being like, hey, like, I know like, you might be busy, but here's this, like, let me know what you think. Because again, if they've agreed to be your mentor, they've agreed to be that help to you and that give you some sort of service. So at times it might seem like, oh, I'm probably like bothering them, like, oh, I'm sending them like all these questions with my feedback. But at the same time, you're not really bothering them because they're there to help you. They want to help you. And if you have a good mentor, that they'll be there to do that for you.
Awesome. Yeah, there in the white shirt.
My name is Diego, and this is a question more for like JT. So like, due to this, like the fortunate events that have happened in Afghanistan, like how would you incorporate that to like your research, like that has more late 1900s and early 2000s? Like, how would you? I know research is all about like changing your questions and stuff. So you've been like incorporating that into your research, or
Yeah, so this, I don't know if you were able to hear the questions from Diego, and actually several people on the discussion board had similar questions, JT, due to I think, recent topics in the world and the news, kind of wanting to get your take on the current situation in Afghanistan, if it related to your research, how you saw connections, or what your thoughts are on that.
I feel like this was gonna was gonna come up. It's come up already here in my TA class. But so when I was writing my thesis, well, first, I think like Dominic was mentioning earlier about changing questions. I was going to do something entirely different. I was going to do something about Iraq, which I guess same region, but different sort of question, different sort of range. I was going to do something a lot more condensed in terms of period, but ended up doing Afghanistan. And when I wrote my thesis, if you read it, which you could, not to be a shill, but it's available on the library in the archives if you want to. But when I wrote the epilogue, I guess I call it, the last chapter of my thesis, it was a very different sort of time. It was a different sort of situation in Afghanistan. In hindsight, it wasn't so different. Sort of the writing was on the wall. But when I was writing my thesis, it was, there was a much more optimistic picture of what was going on in Afghanistan. There was a much more optimism about a potential, a peaceful settlement between the Taliban and the Afghan national government. So when I wrote it, I was on that optimism, in a sense, at least when it came to the Taliban. That was only part of my research question. The other part was Al Qaeda. So it was a very different time. And now, I guess, in terms of recent news, I've got egg on my face. So that's just part of research in a way, changing, especially if you're doing something like history or something related to current events, you're going to be researching stuff, history. I joke about that. Unlike my girlfriend, I'm studying dead people, so I don't have to worry about things changing all that much, or needing IRB approval for consent. But it's, if you're doing something like modern politics or modern political events, things are going to change. Things are going to change rapidly, and the findings of our research might be called into question, or they might be, sort of outdated by then. Right. So, I'm right now, the findings of my research aren't necessarily outdated, but the conclusions that I came to, looking forward, they are now. And it sucks. It especially sucks for those who are living through what is going on currently in Afghanistan. It was very hard news when it was, on every channel and their grandma at the time. But it's just kind of what we gotta live with as researchers, that our research might become obsolete, right? But in a sense that is a good thing, because it means that we're finding a better understanding of the world that we live in, and we're finding a better understanding of the people that we're living on this world with. It doesn't always mean that what changes is a good thing. It might be bad things like what happened in Afghanistan, but it just leaves room for better judgment, better conclusions, and hopefully better research. So just for perfect example, like what happened in Afghanistan is a perfect place for new research to look into why my conclusions failed, why my research has become outdated. So in sort of a morbid sense, there's always more opportunity, but in another sense, it's something we got to live with. It's a part of being of research, where it's not always eternal. It's going to change, and it could change in bad ways.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Madison. My question for both speakers: what was the most challenging part of your project?
So Madison's asking a question for both speakers. The biggest challenge in your project, the most challenging part of it.
Well, for me, the most challenging part was when I decided on, going to lab during the pandemic to start extracting DNA for my project. Extracting DNA was a new method for me. I hadn't done it before. And so I spent about a week working with my professor, just kind of like learning the methods and getting, a handle of it in the lab. So I think it was definitely the most difficult challenge, because that was just like, I was learning something new in the middle of the pandemic, and it was definitely a little scary at first, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, I'm getting this clearance to go back on campus. I want to make sure like I do a good job, and I'm learning this new thing. But I think just having an open mind about it made it easier, and a willingness to learn really also just helped me pick up on it really fast and be able to complete my research in a good amount of time.
For me, my biggest challenge was kind of twofold. First was trying to condense 21 years of complicated human history into into an 80-page research paper. There are definitely so many more things that could have been said that I did not have sort of the time or space or focus for, because we're talking about the history of two very prolific sort of paramilitary groups, multiple national governments, countless individuals that could all have like a book written just about them. But then you kind of have to, it's a sort of a tragedy of doing some broad research like that, is that you do have to kind of generalize, kind of focus. And related to that is being respectful to the diversity of all the different groups involved, while not becoming, while not getting lost in the weeds, I guess. For example, a lot of my research dealt with Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War. And even though, there are 7 main groups and then a multitude of different other groups. And those were just the groups that were supported by the United States and their international allies. And they all had very different sort of cultures and different ideologies and motives. But at the end of the day, I did have to sort of generalize, because I could not spend my entire research paper going over sort of the history of all these different groups and how they developed. And it's the same thing with talking about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Where you have to be, for the sake of the authenticity of your research, the credibility of it, you need to be, wary of how much you generalize, how much you stereotype, in order to save time and in order to keep your focus narrow and coherent, right? Because if you go too broad, you might be able to, you could probably explain everybody, but then you're the people are going to question, okay, what was your research actually about though? What are you trying to say by talking about all these people? So there's kind of like a fine balance you got to get between generalization and specificity. That can be a bit difficult.
We're almost out of time here. I wanted to squeeze in one quick question from the discussion forum, because I think it's an important one. Kavo asked about time commitment. So for an undergraduate project like a CLAS Scholars, a University Scholars Project, just real quick, practically speaking, how many hours a week, a day, et cetera, can students expect to spend, and how did you personally budget that with other undergraduate obligations like classes, et cetera? A quick lightning round answer from each of you. We start with JT.
I would treat research perhaps no more or spend no more time on it than a part-time job, I'd say. So maybe 20 hours a week, maybe probably less. If you're, if you know how to, I guess if you're in the humanities, if you're in STEM and you need to do a lot of things like modeling and calculations, it could perhaps get a bit longer. Dominic, I guess, can speak to that. But purely the biggest time sink for me was the writing. And trying to go back between sources and writing. So I would say that took, I think like 12 to 15 hours a week. And how I budgeted that is basically, I would set a specific time every day where I would do something like writing or do something like categorizing my sources. And that way I didn't spend more time than I needed, but I made sure that I had enough, some time set aside every day to get this stuff done.
Awesome.
Yeah, I would say for me, at least in my field, it can be pretty variable. Like when I first started my project and I got back into the lab, I was in the lab every day from, like 9 to 5, working on the extracting DNA and stuff for maybe about a month. And then at that point, I was able to go like maybe to half days because I was getting a little faster at it. And then there was a period of time where we kind of just like were waiting for the DNA sequencing. So we kind of just had a lull where I wasn't having to do anything at the moment. And then once we got the data back and I was writing, there was a lot more time spent on it. I would say on average, you probably spend as much time. I think JT had a good measure about like a part-time job, maybe like a 3-credit class, like considering your research as like its own sort of class that you take and give it the same amount of time you would for those. Something that I want to mention though, is that something that you don't really always associate with your research, but is actually super important and a big part of it, is the time you spend reading. The time you spend reading to kind of prep for your research. Don't just throw that out the window. Like that is part of you doing your research. That is time you spend, and you can spend a good amount of time each week just like reading stuff. I'm sure JT probably even read more than I did, I'm sure. So, don't discredit yourself that like, oh, I didn't do like any, like, I wasn't in the lab this week, or, oh, I wasn't writing this week. If you were reading still, that's still something big, and that does take up a lot of time.
Awesome. And we are out of time. Everybody give a quick hand for our guests. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it, both of you guys. This was awesome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy graduate student schedules to come and talk to us. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Have a good day, y'all.
Yeah, no problem. Adios, y'all.